Good afternoon. My name is Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Tocqueville program and Notre Dame's program on constitutional studies. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. What a crowd. I was just told we have an overflow room. We're simulcasting in the room next door, right in back of this wall. If folks want a seat and don't have a seat, you should be able to see everything there. Special welcome to all our alumni visitors, and especially to the Constitutional Studies fellows. We have an extraordinary event today. There are a number of individuals I want to recognize who made today's event possible. Pat and Sue Shepard are not here with us today, but their gift made possible this lecture, this event today. So I want to thank and recognize Pat and Sue Shepard. We have some dear friends of the Tocqueville program here today. They're going to get mad at me for doing this, but Bill and Jody Oros flew up from Orlando this morning to be with us. Bill and Jody gave the gift that brought me to Notre Dame, and a special place in my heart for them. So thank you, Bill and Jody. There's a number of friends of the program here. I'm afraid I shouldn't do this because I'm not going to get everyone, but Don and Tim and John and Greg and Patty, John and Betty, thank you for being here, making time, traveling long distances to join us. My assistant, Jen Smith, made all the sandwiches and did everything. I don't know where she is. She's probably doing something right now. She really does all the work for the program, and she, it's just the two of us, and which really means it's just her, and she arranged all of this. So wherever Jen Smith is, thank you, Jen. I also need to recognize and thank my wife, who's 39 and a half weeks pregnant. I told her this morning if she waited until at least 12:45 to have the baby, she could name her. So, if I leave, if I dash out of the room, that's why. There's one special individual I want to recognize today. Chris Bonwit was a dear friend of the Tocqueville program. All the names I just mentioned, he actually introduced me to many of them. About a year ago, Chris and I actually planned this lecture together. Chris loved the idea of Notre Dame asking fundamental and important questions about justice and free markets and our Constitution and Catholicism and what Catholicism and Catholic social thought contributed to the American experiment. Last December, to call Chris was on the top of my to-do list. And I wanted to tell him, hey, we're going to do this lecture. I know the person we need to ask. That was Professor Otteson. I'm going to reach out to him. And I got a call before I could call him that Chris had passed away. Sorry. So this lecture is dedicated to Chris, great friend of Notre Dame, great friend of the program, great friend of me, of mine. He worked in Atlanta, but he loved to come to our events. He'd always be here. He'd always make sure that he was supportive of me and encouraging. And I'm sure he's here with us today. So we're going to dedicate today's lecture to Chris. A number of his colleagues are here, and I'm going to ask one of them, Marty Harshman, to just come up and say a few words about Chris.
Thank you, Philip, for allowing me the invitation to come and just share a few words about Chris Bonwit. But even more so, thank you for dedicating today's lecture in his honor. He was a dear friend to many of us here in the room. He served the university for 19 years as a fundraiser. And he took that opportunity to work for Our Lady's University to a much deeper level, though. He's a graduate of the University of 1970. Went on to get his MBA, served in various leadership roles in the business world that had him traveling around the world for a good 25 years of his life. And then he felt called to come back to Notre Dame and to serve in this role as a fundraiser. And as I mentioned, he did it in a very unique way, a very passionate way, in such that he felt privileged to represent Notre Dame, to go out and build relationships with families who had passions that he felt could make an impact here at our university to take us further. And today's lecture and the Tocqueville program is the perfect example of that. He's here with us, smiling. We know this. But he's also very proud of everyone here and the friendships that you extended to him. So I am here just simply on behalf of our development team, my colleagues that are here in the room and beyond, many of the families that are here with us today or could not make it, to simply say thank you to all of you for being both a friend to Notre Dame, but more importantly, a friend to Chris Bonwit. All the best as you continue your work, Philip, but thank you for dedicating this lecture in Chris's honor.
There's several folks from the development office here today. I know you all have to run out to go to work, but thank you for everything you do. It won't surprise you to know that you're not appreciated enough by the faculty. You make possible what we do, so thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, a bit about today's format. Our principal speaker is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a respondent by a member of our faculty for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. To do proper introductions, I'm going to call to the podium Jack Putz. Jack's a senior and a constitutional studies minor. He's writing his thesis on Justice Scalia's church-state jurisprudence for me, I think. I should say supposedly writing. I haven't actually seen a draft yet. But nonetheless, he still gets to do our introduction today. So, Jack, yeah.
It's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for this afternoon. Dr. James Otteson is a 1990 graduate of the University of Notre Dame. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in the program of Liberal Studies at Notre Dame and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He has taught at the University of Alabama, Georgetown University, New York University, Yeshiva University, and currently teaches at Wake Forest University, where he serves as a professor of economics, the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics, and the executive director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism. Additionally, he serves as a research professor in the Freedom Center and in the philosophy department at the University of Arizona, and as a senior scholar at the Fund for American Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. Otteson specializes in the areas of political philosophy, political economy, history and philosophy of economics, and 18th century moral and political thought. He is also an expert on Adam Smith and the moral foundations of capitalism. Some of his published works include Actual Ethics, What Adam Smith Knew, and The End of Socialism. Providing a response to Dr. Otteson will be our very own Dr. Patrick Deneen, the David A. Potenziani Memorial Associate Professor for Constitutional Studies in Notre Dame's Political Science Department. Professor Deneen is known as one of Notre Dame's best teachers, and his new book, Why Liberalism Failed, will be published in a few weeks by Yale University Press. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our featured speaker, my uncle, Dr. James Otteson.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Jack. And yes, he really is my nephew. We'll see if he still wants to claim that after today. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be here speaking to you today. In fact, I'm astonished at this crowd. What a testament to Jan and to Professor Munoz. My thanks goes to all of them and to Professor Deneen for agreeing to respond. And by the way, for the record, he hasn't seen the remarks I'm going to make, so he's going to do this on the fly. So he's earning his pay today. But it's an honor to be here at my beloved alma mater. So I was a PLS major at Notre Dame. I studied my sophomore year abroad in Innsbruck, Austria. Dr. Alexander Hahn from the mathematics department, who is here, please wave to everybody, Dr. Hahn. He was my director at Innsbruck. He was recently elevated to the status of emeritus professor. I guess we all get older, don't we? One of the high privileges we enjoy, ladies and gentlemen, by being part of a university community, and I mean it's a high privilege, is the opportunity to listen to a variety of perspectives, including those that differ from our own. We honor this privilege by engaging, charitably yet critically, even ideas that challenge our deeply held views. Too often today, I think people shy away from controversial ideas because they're afraid we might discover disagreement. We might think that, it's impossible for us to have productive or constructive conversations about ideas that are controversial. But if there's any place where we can have a discussion of competing and controversial ideas, it should be a university. And so I congratulate everyone here, and Professor Munoz and the program, for accepting this responsibility of the Academy to enter into the fray. And so let's get to it. I think I have, 2 hours only to speak? Now, the title of my talk that I gave to Professor Munoz, I said, how about comparative historical approaches to competing systems of political economy and empirical and moral analysis? He said, how about that? Okay. So let me begin by stating that I actually will not be using the word capitalism, and I hope that doesn't disappoint you. But I have a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the term capitalism, like socialism, like communism, like many other isms, is fraught with connotations. People mean different things by it, and most of those connotations are negative. Somebody calls you a capitalist, that's usually not meant as a compliment. Somebody calls you a socialist, that's usually not meant as a compliment either. So those terms conjure up lots of associations, most of them negative. In my experience, when you start with defending an ism, what often happens is that you have the pro and the con people sort of line up and dig in their heels and get ready to fight either side without paying much attention to what the people from the other perspectives are saying. So they don't listen a lot to the arguments or the evidence or the perspectives of the other side. Often produces more heat than light. So I would like to propose a slightly different way of proceeding. I would like to propose that we first start out with talking about the moral values that we would like for a system of political economy to champion. The kinds of social problems or perhaps the other moral or other issues that we would like for the system of political economy to solve or at least potentially address. Then, after that, let's turn to an evaluation of the feasibility or the extent to which the different systems of political economy can be instantiated in practice. And that includes a full accounting of their costs and their benefits, including their opportunity costs. That's something we might come back to, the concept of opportunity cost. As well as what exactly are the political and other mechanisms available to us to effectuate the goals that we would like to champion. And then finally, the third step would be to see if we can determine which system of competing systems of political economy, which one stands the best chance of most closely achieving the aims that we would like to achieve, while not allowing us or requiring us to sacrifice things that we think are more important. Now, I will say one quick thing about an accounting of costs and benefits. So by saying that, especially the opportunity costs, I'm alluding to something that I have written about, which is the necessity, I think, of avoiding what I would call nice-if arguments. In political theory, we get a lot of nice-if arguments. It would be nice if we had all of the things we want or need. So it would be nice if we had all of the goods and services everyone wants or needs, or if we had proper recognition of the precious dignity of all individuals, global peace, prosperity. Across the hall, I understand we are competing with a brigadier general who's talking about Korea. You made the right choice. I don't know. We'll have to see. Supportive and cohesive communities, liberty, security, equality, and so on. No one, or at least almost no one, I think, will dispute the value of goals like those. But merely stating goals doesn't get us very far. The hard questions, the real questions, I think, are how do we achieve them? Given that we live in a world of scarce resources, what do we have to give up in order to achieve them? Or what trade-offs should we be willing to make? When the goals conflict, which should take precedence? And given that our institutions are created and managed by imperfect, even, this is Notre Dame, I think I can say fallen creatures, what is the likelihood of their success? So let's begin with what I think will be, I propose to be, an uncontroversial statement. We want a humane and just society. Wherever anyone is on the political or economic spectrum, everybody wants a humane and just society. Now, of course, we may disagree about the proper definitions of humane and just, and we may also disagree about the best ways to achieve them or at what cost. One of the central and enduring problems facing a liberal society, and by liberal I don't necessarily mean progressive or in line with the Democratic Party, and maybe not what it is that Professor Deneen will argue has failed. But by liberal society, I mean one that places one of its leading political values as the liberty of the individual. One of the enduring problems facing such a society is how to adjudicate competing conceptions of the good life. How do we adjudicate competing hierarchies or schedules of value? So let me give you a concrete example. Two social issues that almost everyone who endorses a humane and just society, whatever their definitions are, two issues that almost all of them will focus on are poverty and inequality. Poverty and inequality. But let me ask you, which is more important? If you could solve one of them, but only one, which would you solve? Poverty or inequality? Now, I think your answer to that question will go some way towards predicting the system of political economy you might be inclined to favor. But this isn't an idle question, because it seems to be the actual dilemma we face. Now, many people think that the two are linked. If you solve one, you'll solve the other. But alas, that doesn't seem to be true. So throughout most of human history, human beings have been relatively equal in wealth. The pharaoh or the emperor or the king might have had much more than everyone else. But with those few exceptions aside, most human beings were relatively equal, but they were relatively equally poor. For at least the last 12,000 years of human history, going back to the earliest beginnings of agriculture, average gross domestic product per person per day averaged between $1 and $3 per day per person in contemporary dollars. Between $1 and $3. Just think about whether you could live on 3 contemporary dollars per day, and that's it. And then something began to happen. There were some overall increases in some isolated places around the world in the 17th century, principally in Holland and Britain. Then this began to spread and increase in the 18th century. And in the 19th century, it really picked up steam, so to speak, enabling, for example, the Industrial Revolution. And then in the 20th and 21st centuries, it really took off to today what are entirely unprecedented levels in all of human history. By some estimates, the average person alive today in the world is some 100 times wealthier in real terms than the average person alive in just 1800, so the founding of the United States. Some of you may have seen, I've got a little picture here that illustrates the graph. You don't even need to know the numbers. If you see it, that's fine, but you can see that's quite a hockey stick. So you don't have to be much of a social scientist to see, well, if this is 12,000 years ago and this is today, what needs to be explained? Not all of this, it's this. The change is what needs to be explained. I think I printed out 20 of these. I may have slightly underestimated the number of people who would be interested. So what about America? So today the average American enjoys approximately $157 per day. Again, compare that to the $3 per day average for human history. The worldwide average is approximately $45 per day. Yeah, as amazing as those numbers are, they don't capture the full increase, since they don't capture so-called hidden wealth. Let me just give you an example or two of what we mean by hidden wealth. Consider that at the turn of the 20th century, Andrew Carnegie, you've all heard of Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest Americans ever to have lived, his fortune in today's dollars would make him worth about $310 billion. Now, the richest person alive today, Bill Gates, I think at the moment is worth about $90 billion. Give or take $1 billion. What's $1 billion among friends? But Andrew Carnegie, despite his wealth, could not save his beloved mother from dying from pneumonia because the cheap and easily available antibiotics that are available to us were not available in his day at any price. That's a kind of hidden wealth. Or consider President Calvin Coolidge's son. So in 1924, President Calvin Coolidge's 16-year-old son was playing tennis on the White House lawn. Maybe some of you heard this story. He got a blister. He's playing tennis with his brother. He got a blister on the third toe of his right foot. He developed an infection, turned into a staph infection, and he died within a week. Not even the President of the United States in 1924 could save his son from what would have been today an easily treated infection, because the medicines to cure the infection were simply not available at any price. I'll give you one other example. Consider the internet. Here's a question for you. How much money would it take for you to be willing to give up accessing the internet for the rest of your life? A few years ago, an economics professor started asking his students, polling his students with that question, how much would it take for them to give up the internet for the rest of their lives? Their answers were unbelievable. They said things like tens of millions, hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars it would take. Some of them said things like, what life would I have without the internet? But while you're thinking about your number, whatever that would be, what you'd be willing to give it up for, consider this. How much money do those same students actually themselves pay for access to the internet? The answer for most of them is zero. Access to the internet for most of them is provided by their parents or by their universities or schools or Starbucks or other companies, so they themselves pay nothing. So something that to them is worth millions, even billions of dollars is something that they pay nothing for. And of course, the internet didn't even exist until only extremely recently in human history. So this is something that provides enormous value to us that's not captured, or at least not directly captured, in gross domestic product and GDP. So this increase I'm talking about in prosperity is real and substantial, and again, historically unprecedented. Now, tragically, there are still people living in the world today who are at those historical norms of absolute poverty, so there's still a lot of work to do. But the good news, indeed the great news, is that the proportion of people living at those levels has now reached all-time lows. In 1900, the proportion of people worldwide living at the $1 to $3 per day per person range was approximately 90%. In 1900, it was approximately 90% of the people. Today, it stands at about 5%, and it's falling rapidly. In 1980, just 1980, do some of you remember 1980? 90% of all Chinese lived at those levels of absolute poverty. Today, only 10% do. So in just 40 years, over 1 billion people in China alone have risen out of poverty. In all likelihood, in the next decade or so, during your lifetimes, God willing, and mine, we will see the number of people living at absolute poverty decrease to 0. This is one of the most important and significant achievements in all of human history, I would submit, though a story that somehow many of us just don't know. We don't hear that story. But these facts raise several questions. First and foremost, what led to this? Maybe you have your theories. What led to that big hockey stick change? Second question is, how do we spread it to yet more people, the 700 to 800 million or so people who are still living at those levels? And I think these are not merely academic questions or merely of historical curiosity. People's survival, not to mention their chances of constructing lives of meaning and purpose, their survival can depend on the political and economic institutions that their countries adopt. So I think we'd better get it right. Now, let's return to inequality for a second. It turns out that the same political, economic, and cultural institutions that have enabled the great enrichment, as Deirdre McCloskey has called it, also allow inequality. There's the rub. Substantially, everyone gains, but they don't gain at the same rate. By the same token, as Stanford historian Walter Scheidel has recently argued, I cite him, he just had a book that came out in the earlier part of this year, called The Levelers. He talks about the great causes, historical causes of equality. So what creates equality, historically? He calls them the Four Horsemen. That's why I thought you would appreciate that reference. What are the Four Horsemen? Mass warfare, revolution, state collapse, and plague. Those are the four things, historically speaking, that create equality in the world. Mass warfare, revolution, state collapse, and plague. In other words, material equality, historically, has been brought about principally by widespread violence and death. After surveying thousands of years of human history and hundreds of communities, empires, states, nations, here's Scheitel's conclusion. I'll quote him for you. There is no repertoire of benign means of compression that has ever achieved the results that are even remotely comparable to those produced by the Four Horsemen. There simply does not seem to be an easy way to vote, regulate, or teach our way to significantly greater equality. End quote. So how do we get equality then? If human history is any guide, only by violence and death. And humanity's long history of relative equality amidst absolute poverty seems to attest to that. So, remember that question I asked you about poverty versus inequality? If we compare the goals of reducing poverty and reducing equality, the clear winner, at least it seems to me, is reducing poverty. If material inequality is the price we have to pay on the one hand for reduction and possible elimination of absolute poverty, and on the other hand, for giving up widespread violence and death, then that seems to be a price worth paying. The fact that the political economic institutions that enable some to have more than others, even much more than others, are the same institutions that enable growing overall prosperity and peace seems then to confront us with this stark choice. We can have prosperity and a reduction, even an elimination of absolute poverty, or we can have equality, but also poverty, violence, and death. For me, the choice is clear. Now, how am I doing on time, Professor Munoz? Let's go 5 more minutes. So what are the institutions? How did we get it? So what's the explanation for how we got that hockey stick? Over the last 40 years or so, empirical investigation, historical empirical investigation, has centered on a relatively simple formula. Those countries that are able to do just relatively well 3 things will increase their prosperity. The countries that are not very good at doing these 3 things do not have increasing prosperity. What are the 3 things? First, people need to have their persons protected, meaning that others may not kill or enslave or assault or arbitrarily arrest them. Their persons must be protected. Second, people need to have their property and their possessions protected, so others may not trespass on them, steal from them, defraud them. And third and finally, people need to have the freedom to trade, exchange, and partner with others, and have their voluntary agreements, whatever they are, respected and enforced. So you can think of these as the 3 Ps: person, property, voluntary promise. Nice mnemonic device for those of you professors who are going to give quizzes to students afterwards. Are you going to do that? And you can think of this as an empirical conception of justice. Justice is having those 3 Ps protected, injustice is having them infringed. And it turns out that if we have public institutions that protect that conception of justice, then prosperity ensues. People will all on their own, without having to be directed or mandated or supervised or nudged, they begin to find ways to use their time, their talent, their treasure to improve their own conditions. And the more of that we have, the more overall prosperity we have. Now that's a surprisingly simple formula, but extremely difficult to instantiate in practice. Just think about, cast your mind's eye back on some of the great civilizations in human history. Think about the pharaohs who built those pyramids. That took a lot of capital to build those pyramids, didn't it? Where'd they get that capital? Or think about the Romans who built the Colosseum and the roads and the aqueducts. That took a lot of capital. Where did they get that capital? Well, the answer in both cases is the same: slavery, theft, imperialism. What do we call that? That's not protecting the 3 Ps. That's why you don't get a bump in the overall prosperity. That long, low red line stays constant. You look at when the pharaohs were building the pyramids, no overall increase in prosperity. When the Romans were building their empire, no overall increase. The pharaoh was wealthy, the emperor was wealthy, or the Song dynasty in the first century, the first millennium AD. The emperor's wealthy, the emperor's family's wealthy. How about everybody else? Not so much. Now let's relate this to the individual. So I've been talking about wealth. Is wealth the only thing that matters in life?
No.
No? I'm going to answer no to that.
Just let you know.
We have some work to do here. Father Hesper, we've got some work to do. Wealth is not the only thing, I don't think, that matters in life, but here's something I would argue. What wealth can do is enable other things that do matter in life. So if I'm worried about whether I can eat today, or whether my children can eat today, or which of my children can eat today, then what am I not thinking about? I'm not thinking about where are my kids going to go to college. I'm not thinking about when's the next iPhone coming out, what's the summum bonum of human life, or is Notre Dame ever going to win another national championship? People at those historically low levels do not have the luxury to think about those things. So what wealth can do is address our more pressing needs, food, clothing, and shelter, so that people can begin to construct for themselves lives of meaning and purpose. So there's my first conclusion for you. What I would propose for your consideration is that we should endorse those institutions that first and foremost enable people to rise out of poverty, which first and foremost means public institutions that protects people's, everyone's, persons, property, and promise. Now, one other point I'd like to make about this, what about the individuals? What individual duties does that mean? What duties do we have as individuals? If those are the public institutions we need, what about our personal obligations? Consider that almost everything any of us has was provided for us comes to us from other people. I assume that almost nobody in this room today made your own clothing or made your own, that looks like a nice iPad you have there, Tim. You didn't make those things yourself. Other people make these things for you now. There are two ways we can get things from other people that we want, aren't there? Two general ways. So suppose I notice that my nephew Jack there's got a very nice suit, and I would like to have that suit. There are two ways I could get that suit from him, aren't there? What are the two ways?
Buy it or steal it.
I'm glad you said it in that order. So one way is I could steal it from him, right? I could kill him, I could steal it, I could defraud him, say I'm going to pay you $1,000 in a couple of weeks and then just not pay you. I could do that. That's one way. What would we call that? Economists call that a zero-sum transaction. Why is that a zero-sum transaction? Minus one suit for Jack, plus one suit for me, minus one plus one equals zero. Zero-sum transaction. That doesn't increase wealth, it just moves it from one place to another. So what's the other way that I might get that suit from Jack? What did you say? Could make him an offer, couldn't I? How much would you take for your suit, Jack?
How much you got?
Suppose I offer Jack $500 for his suit. And suppose Jack agrees? Okay. Now, what about in that case? And suppose we effectuate the transaction. So I give him $500, he gives me the suit. Here's a question that every student should be asked at every university in the country. You have a transaction like that, who benefits from it? Which party benefited from that transaction? Both. That's a positive sum transaction. Plus value for him, plus value for me, you add them together, we both benefited. That's the nature of the transition from an extractive economy where people just take to a cooperative economy where people actually have mutual benefit. The key difference between those two is that in one case you have the right to say no thank you, that's when it's a cooperative exchange. In the other case you don't. So if you're enslaved, stolen from, etc., you weren't asked permission. Now how do we explain that big hockey stick and how do we explain the proper relations between human beings? So here's the final point I would like to make. The central argument for I believe, for the kind of the system of political economy we ought to have should first of all, remember I said, be one that instantiates the moral values we have. What's the moral value involved here? How should I treat another person? What's a better way to deal with another person? Extraction or cooperation? I hope the answer is obvious. Cooperation is better. Why is that better? Because if Jack has a right to say no thank you, if the other person has a right to say no thank you, and I'm required to respect that choice, that means that I must now respect that other person as a moral agent full of human dignity. Now you are a person who is a peer to me. You are not a superior to me. I am not substituting my set of values for yours and mandating that you follow my choices. I must respect you as a peer, which means that I respect you as a full moral agent. If you have a system of political economy in which each person, all people, have that right of opt-out, the opt-out option, then what we're doing is building into the institutions we have this respect for all people. So the first argument for this system of political economy I'm talking about is that it builds into it from the ground up a mutual respect for the dignity, the inherent dignity of all people. What's the second argument? The second argument's the economic one. The more transactions you have, when you go into Starbucks and you order your double pumpkin spice mocha latte, and the barista says that'll be $5, you give $5 and you get the drink. What does each of you say? What does the barista say to you when you give the $5? Says thank you. What do you say? Thank you. That double thank you is indicative of the mutually beneficial nature of that transaction. The more transactions we have like that, the more overall prosperity that generates. Okay, the last point I would like to make is about equality. So under the system of political economy that I'm talking about, where you have public protections of the 3 Ps, person, property, and promise, where we encourage cooperative voluntary transactions and discourage or even rule out and punish extractive exchanges, will material inequality ensue? The answer is yes, it will. So do you have material inequality? Yes, you do. But there is a different kind of equality that set of institutions does endorse. And that I would like to propose for your consideration might even be more important. So substantially everyone who's gaining in these kinds of this mass, what Edmund Phelps calls mass flourishing, all classes gain, although not at the same rate. But there is a different kind of equality that may even be, that's at least equally as important, I would say, but and possibly even more important, and that is an equality of moral agency. Because in this system, if everyone possesses the right to say no, thank you, then that reduces everyone, regardless of class, station, level of wealth, religion, or any other thing that might divide us. It reduces everyone to an equality of moral agency. No one has the right to superimpose onto someone else's moral agency. If I have the right to say no thank you to any offer, if you have the right to say no thank you to any offer, if we all have the right to say no thank you to any offer, we possess a deep and profound kind of moral equality that not only encourages us to exchange with one another because we want to cooperate, but that also requires us to respect one another. I think that's a moral argument for a certain kind of system of political economy. Now, should we call that capitalism? Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by that. People often mean by capitalism something closer to cronyism, where favored industries or firms or people get special charters and protections, et cetera, from the government. I don't consider that's not what I'm talking about. My argument would oppose that. That's just another form of extraction. But the kind of system that I'm talking about is the one that leads to this equality of moral agency and historically has led to unprecedented levels of wealth. Adam Smith called it, quote, the obvious and simple system of moral natural liberty. So a system that proposes both prosperity and morality, I think, is one that is worth defending, regardless of what we call it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Can you hear me now? Well, you are witnessing a complete setup here, because not only in the question that's been posed to us, do we have someone who's been invited, an expert, world expert on this question, who thinks about this day and night, and when he sleeps at night and dreams, he dreams of markets, and offering to him 30 minutes to explicate on the subject of his expertise. But then Professor Munoz invites a professor of political philosophy, 10 minutes to respond to this question. So we can tell what already is what we're to conclude from the debate, such as it is. And secondly, to have someone as eloquent, articulate, and persuasive as Jim Otteson, a longtime friend, and I hope still a friend, even more so. I actually want to bring capitalism back into the equation, and I agree with Jim that it's a loaded term, it's an ism, but I want to suggest that the way in which Jim, as I suspected he would justify I guess what we call a moral market system, and to differentiate it from a kind of ideological system called capitalism I want to suggest that that's an argument that's true in theory, but not often true in fact. And that in fact, the ways in which the market system is justified in just the way that Jim argued for, is this too high?
Turn this one off. Excuse me. Try it now. Just use the one on the other panel.
Okay. Is this better? All right, good. The way in which Jim justified the market system that he suggests is to point to the hockey stick, the miracle of the hockey stick. But here's my question. He used the example, for example, of, was it Carnegie, right, remind me again, was it the son or somebody dies of some pestilence? His mother dies of pestilence. Use the example of the internet, which, Al Gore invented about 10 years ago. And those of you of a certain age, I ask you to think back on your childhoods when, if we look at that hockey stick, right, even just 30 or 40 years ago, we were much lower on that hockey stick. And to think about the misery of your lives, how miserable you were when you were a child, how awful it was, in fact, to know that in the future everything was going to be better. Just as you should today be thinking how absolutely miserable your life is. The diseases that will still face us, the poverty, the intense poverty we are living in today, if we look at that hockey stick moving forward. We are absolutely the most miserable human beings on the planet, because if we point forward this trajectory of the hockey stick, we're basically as poor as those people 12,000 years ago, if we project that 12,000 years in advance. Well, unless we extract everything in the planet, and we're going to go back to that bottom line, which seems to me another distinct possibility not raised by Jim. So that's two possibilities. Either we're miserable because we're going to be fantastically wealthy forever and ever more wealthy, or this hockey stick happens to coincide with a time of extraordinary extraction of fossil fuels that's probably not going to last forever. Either one suggests to me that this argument is used in a way to shroud our actual condition, which is we have to ask the question, what constitutes human happiness? Is there a point on that hockey stick where we can say, we've got enough, this is good, life is good? Or is it the case that this system always makes us desire more, and that we can never be happy unless we have more? It points us to the condition that both Augustine and Tocqueville suggests are the condition of restlessness. And for Augustine, restlessness is a condition that can finally be solved, S-A-L-V-E-D, once we come into God's presence. For Tocqueville, we don't have that comfort anymore, or hope. And the only thing that can give us any solve is the endless and constant pursuit of thing after thing, the condition he describes of the modern world when it comes to America. It seems to me to ask the question, is capitalism moral, is like asking, is a hammer moral? Our economic order is a tool, and I agree with Jim, for achieving certain ends of human beings, so that questions need to be asked, does this system serve our genuine and proper human ends? And prosperity is that end, but is there a way in which we can say we've achieved a condition of happiness? Now, to answer this question, there's no better place to turn as a starting place, since we're at Notre Dame, than the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Drawing on long-standing social encyclical tradition, which was inaugurated by Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical De Rerum Novarum, we find in the Catechism some of the following statements, which interestingly appear in the elaboration of the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal. Quote, the development of economic activity and growth in production are meant to provide for the needs of human beings. Economic life is not meant solely to multiply goods produced and to increase profit or power. It is ordered first to the service of persons and the whole man and the entire human community. Economic activity conducted according to its own proper ends is to be exercised within the limits of the moral order. Within an existing moral order. The economy doesn't itself produce the moral order. I think it's a suggestion that Jim's at least suggesting, that in and through our transactions we can produce a kind of moral order. The Catechism suggests a moral order in some sense has to exist to environ our economic activity. The Church thus calls for thinking of and attempting to instantiate an economic system that avoids subsuming economic activity to a false end, whether, it argues, in the form of ideological form of market capitalism, driven by a narrow materialism, pursuit of things without limit, or to the ideological form of socialism, equality, that in which there is no freedom in markets, in the pursuit of a false and unrealizable condition of equality. In other words, the Catechism suggests that both of these conditions are false, or that we can't hold them to be mutually exclusive. To quote the Catechism again, a theory that makes profit the exclusive norm and ultimate end of economic activity is morally unacceptable. The disordered desire for money cannot but produce perverse effects. Every practice that reduces persons to nothing more than a means of profit enslaves man, leads to the idolizing of money, and contributes to the spread of atheism. You cannot serve God and mammon. Well, thank goodness atheism is not spreading in our world today. Quote, the Church has rejected the totalitarian and atheistic ideologies associated in the modern times with communism or socialism. She has likewise refused to accept in the practice of capitalism, individualism, and the absolute primacy of the law of the marketplace over human labor. Regulating the economy solely by centralized planning perverts the basis of social bonds. Regulating it solely by the law of the marketplace fails social justice, for there are many needs that cannot be satisfied by the market. Reasonable regulation of the marketplace and economic initiatives in keeping with a just hierarchy of values and a view of the common good is to be commended. Now, too often the debate, and I think Professor Otteson did this, the debate is framed either you're for prosperity or for equality. Either you're, whatever you want to call it, capitalist or free market person, or you're a socialist. And the Church categorically refuses this as an either-or condition. And in fact demands that we think as a community how we can order this tool, our economy, to achieve the ends of social good that create solidarity as well as prosperity in our community. The Church, thus, in condemning socialism and communism, commends free markets, but not capitalism. So how do we differentiate these two things? I take it that the Catholic social teaching rejects market ideology, and I think Jim suggests this as well, but I think too often his argument is used by market ideologues to advance this position, particularly the fundamentalist belief that any state intervention in the marketplace, or nearly any state intervention in the marketplace, is unjustified as what is an intrusion on the autonomous realm of economic activity. Market fundamentalism thus conceives of the realm of politics and the realm of economics as entirely separate spheres, or at least perhaps even tends to the more radical view that there's one market and many polities, that the market is the most comprehensive human form of organization, while political entities exist within a market, and thus are fundamentally governed by the norms and demands of the market. And if you think about much of our politics, that's how it's arranged. Bill Clinton once said that when he died, he wanted to come back as the bond market. So it was the most powerful thing in the world. Well, I guess whenever he was thinking about a policy, his advisors would say, well, what about the bond market? By contrast, if we go back to Aristotle or Aquinas, markets are to be understood as literally within polities. They're the marketplaces, the agora. And they are governed thus by the city's expectations that its activities are ordered to the public good and embedded in a moral order, oriented to the common good. Thus, we need to think, I think, in the first place, as markets as more plural than singular, as places and relationships, not a free-floating entity that is everywhere and nowhere. Thus conceived, markets are properly understood to serve their communities. You can see it and you can experience, sorry if I'm being too nostalgic here, but go down to the South Bend Farmers Market. And that's a market. And that's a market that's embedded in a community that builds fellow feeling and norms of reciprocity, and even what Aristotle calls for in market relationships, gratuity, the graces. The need for what Benedict XVI and Pope Francis have both called the gift economy, an economy that has a place for gratuitousness, something that goes beyond merely the pursuit of profit. In the town I grew up in, small town in Connecticut, we had a market, a local town, that was extensively local. Much of the money in the town circulated in our town. You could see how the market operated. Mortgages were held by the banks. My mom, I used to walk with her down to the local savings and loan, and she would pay her note, she would say. And the mortgage was kept there. And it was part of the fabric of the community that you understood by paying your mortgage. Remember George Bailey when there's the run on the bank? That your mortgage is, made possible by your neighbors who are saving their money in those banks. Most of the businesses in those towns were owned and operated by the parents of my classmates. These were the people that sponsored the Little League teams, the Boy Scouts, the parade floats, the charitable giving, a wide array of civic activities. These are the people we now extract from these towns so they can come to Notre Dame, never to return, so they can all become consultants. A portion then of the profits of these people was paid back into the community in the form of grace or gift. This is the activity of a market, and in many ways it's the opposite of a market ideology. Today we speak of a single market, and while, as Jim rightly states, this market has produced unparalleled prosperity, if again we look at that hockey stick, that prosperity is not just unequal, it is massively unequal, immorally unequal. In a report appearing just 3 days ago, which was produced by Credit Suisse, I can't even believe they allowed this to be published, they found that 50% of the world's wealth today is held by 1% of the world's population. So look at that hockey stick, and basically half of that wealth is owned by 1% of the population. This is a jump of 8% since the economic crisis of 2008, which you thought would have been a wake-up call that the concentration of wealth in a very small portion of our population was not good, politically, socially, economically, and otherwise. Now, Jim would be the first to point out, as he did toward the end, this is not capitalism in the sense that he means it. This is crony capitalism, the skewing of markets by powerful actors for the maintenance of their positions. Those, I think, like Jim, who believe in a certain kind of moral market system are the first to call for the cessation of such rent-seeking, the manipulation of regulation and legislation for the benefit of the wealthy. But it is in many ways the market ideology that has allowed, masked, and indeed argued it's simply a choice between socialism and capitalism that has permitted this radical inequality and indeed justified it in moral terms. Crony capitalism, in my view, is not a perversion of the capitalist market ideology or even Jim's argument, but in some ways a predicted outcome. As a result of several decades of fundamentalist market ideology that became dominant in Washington, D.C., certainly following the election of Ronald Reagan, the effort to combat socialism in our economy allowed the inevitable trajectory of ideological capitalism, the concentration of economic power, especially in the form of monopolistic combinations and practices. This then in turn allowed for the capture of governmental organizations, Congress, and so on, that claimed the market needed to enjoy its sphere of autonomy, why we couldn't patrol monopolies. Lacking a well-conceived understanding of the end and purpose of the economy beyond never-ending GDP growth, and allowing the rise of monopolistic concentrations for fear of restraining a globalizing marketplace, our public order established the conditions for large actors to capture the public order itself, which not only led to the acceleration of concentrations of wealth and the weakening of public order, but I think is directly responsible for the rise of the likes of Donald Trump and Brexit. Those of you who don't like Donald Trump and Brexit need to look back at its origins, which is precisely in the weakening of the political order in the face of this market ideology. At the same time, we do see a very successful market ideology in our world today, not in our economy, but in all the places it shouldn't be. And the idea that you can sequester the market ideology to the market, it seems to me, has been falsified by our contemporary experience. First, in regards to families and marriage and children and our sexual relations. We have today a paradise of a free market in relational activity. That is, I think, can't be described as anything other than a catastrophe. Our rates of divorce and out-of-wedlock birth, of abortion and childlessness, right, declining birth rate in America, are scandalously high in various portions of our population. This stunning outbreak of sexual scandal that's taken place in the last few weeks should lead us to reflect on the incredible costs of the sexual revolution, especially for women, and the deep problem of a sexual ethic of consent, of a consumer society. I choose this, especially if it's disembedded from a set of moral norms and practices. Progressive liberals are very good at pointing out the way that powerful economic actors can manipulate consent in areas like credit and consumption, but they show a touching faith in the belief that consent might someday be perfectly achieved in the area and realm of sexual activity. And I say the same is true of conservatives in economic activity. So everybody's got their war horses. Education, great institutions such as like this, is also increasingly dominated by ideological free market mindset. The students are consumers, faculty are employees, and the cheaper you can hire them, the better. Increasingly being replaced by low-cost labor or the internet. The curriculum is a smorgasbord, whatever you want. We have no authority to say what it is you should learn as an adult to a young person. Schools are driven to provide a mass market, identical product. And those who work at universities, well, fewer and fewer of them are like Chris Bonwit, who love an institution and stay at it because they care about it and they care about its traditions. Rather, everything is fungible because that's what a market is. And the ends and purposes of education become subsumed to economic demands, and every activity of a school or university must be justified in terms of its market value. The liberal arts are dying before our eyes, not because they're useless, but because we are dominated by the servile arts and a servile mindset, how we can serve the market. And lastly, we see the acceleration of this market ideology becoming dominant in our thinking about religion. This is perhaps the one form of belief that might restrain the market ideology from dominating all aspects of our life. But it itself is increasingly subsumed by this market ideology. Churches are like consumer goods. Hey, there's even a prosperity gospel. You can shop. You can particularly shop, as my colleague David Campbell proves. If your political views don't match up with your church, go find another church. Never challenge your political views. As documented by Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith, the most dominant religious belief, especially among our young people today, is moral therapeutic deism, a feel-good belief that God wants us to be nice and happy, and if we do so, we'll go to heaven. Religion thus makes no demands, among other things, on a consumerist mindset, and not unsurprisingly, it fades as an object of interest in a world of endless choice, consumerism, and materialism. The Catechism's prediction that capitalism, this market ideology, leads to atheism is looking more and more prescient. In sum, there is really no such thing as a free market if we understand it in this ideological sense. In the economic realm, either the market is ordered to a public good, or, under socialism, eliminated, or toward narrowly private ends. Economic markets can be moral or immoral, but where this market ideology prevails, and it's most likely to prevail when the hockey stick is brought out, market forms of thinking and behavior are likely to arise in areas where they shouldn't predominate. Areas, as I've suggested, such as family and sexuality and education and religion. So today it seems to me we lack a really good free market where we need one, and we have very bad free markets where they shouldn't exist. So is it any wonder that I'm writing a book called Why Liberalism Failed? Thank you.
Very good. That's the type of spirited exchange we try to host here at the Tocqueville program in Constitutional Studies. I will say I did only give Professor Deneen 10 minutes, but it's because he likes limits so much. I thought I was doing him a favor. Yeah. Okay, we have a tradition here of always inviting our undergraduate students to ask the first set of questions. So students, when you stand up, give us your name and your place here at Notre Dame, and I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear it. Go ahead, Jack.
This question is for Professor Deneen.
Jack, tell us who you are. Yeah.
Sorry. Jack Otteson. I'm a student here at Tocqueville program. Professor Deneen, you mentioned the Greek marketplace, where the market was the polity, but you were also killed there if you wandered around the streets doing philosophy. I have friends who agree with the critiques of capitalism who think we should go back to medieval communities where you made your own tables and lived in communities, but you were killed if the next door feudal lord didn't like your feudal lord. You also mentioned the farmers market in South Bend, where my friends go to buy avocados and barely tomatoes, but I doubt my friends here would want to drop their Notre Dame education and actually participate in that market by giving up their education and suddenly have to make a career of growing avocados and tomatoes. So, what is your idea of what we go to avoid this free market of sexual morality, and the loss of spiritual wealth that we see?
Why don't you go ahead and summarize that?
Well, I think that the question is, am I not engaging in sort of rank nostalgia about how great things used to be in the Middle? I didn't mention the Middle Ages, but yeah, sure, the Middle Ages were the blooming of Christendom, and what alternative, or that Notre Dame students, as much as they might like to shop at the South Bend market, don't want to give up their education. I think I think this is one of the ways in which such a critique as mine is often framed, that you simply want to just go back to some point in history. And I wasn't invoking Aristotle to say we should go back to the polis as such. I was really just trying to describe the way in which, for Aristotle, a couple things. First of all, the market is embedded in a polity. I didn't say it's the same. It's embedded within a polity, so that we understand this is where the ordering of our floors is really quite inappropriate. I saw an economist back there earlier, because the economists are above us. But Aristotle, the political science department, Aristotle argued that politics is the architectonic science. It's the most fundamental science. So we've got the ordering of the floors wrong here. In other words, that the concern for the common good is generated out of the political life, out of our shared common life together. And that part of thinking about the common good involves thinking about the nature of the economy and in what way is the economy serving the common good. And that was the way I wanted to invoke Aristotle, not that we should go back to Greece. I don't think we should go back to anything. I think we need to think forward about what are we going to do about our condition now. And it would seem to me that, and I think probably, I'm guessing Professor Otteson would agree with me, we have an economic system that really is crony capitalism today, that's dominated by a number of institutions, economic actors that are a constant threat to the economic and political order of our nation, right, that hold it hostage, too big to fail, ought not to exist. And I think we could at least begin to agree this is not serving the common good. And what if we thought about how can we use the levers and engines of government not to empower or to assist those institutions, as they're able to buy a lot of influence, but to empower markets, to empower smaller actors in our market, and thereby allow more people to participate and to benefit from a very prosperous economy through direct ownership and participation in this economy, not as salary earners, but potentially as owners. It seems to me that a market can be designed in a certain way where you advantage those actors, such as our contemporary monopolists, or you can benefit other actors, a wider variety of people who might become entrepreneurs and owners of property and so forth. So I'm really calling for us to look forward, given the condition that we're in today, and to create what I would call is actually genuinely much freer market than the one we have today, which ironically is probably going to need some significant intervention by the government. That's the irony.
Jim, do you want to comment on that?
No, let's get some more questions.
Okay, some more. Go ahead.
All right.
Real loud.
You mentioned that the world today seems to believe that inequality is unequal because the percent of the wealth is compared to 1% of people. But my question is, where would you draw the line when it comes to inequality? So what level of inequality has matter of principle, would be allowable. It just seems to me like that passage, like not, it's logically unavoidable path to complete socialism, complete equality, where's the line of principle?
Okay, question on or if any, you mentioned
The current
there's
state
a level of
inequality.
inequality that's intolerable, immoral. Where do you draw the line? When does inequality become immoral?
I think this is a task and a question for the political community to reflect upon. I don't know that there's any hard and fast rule, but I do know that if you have our current condition of inequality, you're likely to get the politics we have today. So how far would you have to go? And I'm not talking simply about redistribution. I'm talking about, again, reordering our markets so that more people are able to participate in ownership. More people are able, for example, to extract higher wages.
Extract higher wages?
Extract higher wages through collective bargaining, something that's in the catechism. Mm-hmm. Right?
Okay.
The popes have supported labor unions.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, I'm aware of that.
That's,
yeah.
Okay, extract, bargain for higher wages.
Okay.
Right?
Earn?
Sure. Be paid a just wage.
Oh.
Anyway, but it seems to me that this is a conversation for a polity to decide, and not one that's essentially governed by a kind of market ideology and a captured government in many ways by that ideology.
Okay, student question for Professor Otteson.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know your name, but stand up.
And my question to Dr. Otteson is, you mentioned that wealth is not the only thing that matters, but it enables other good things. So thinking about good things such as literature and music, you can argue that there's a preponderance of production of those things within that holistic timeline curve. But whenever the area is flatlined, I think you could argue you have a production of maybe less works of literature and less pieces of music, but ones of better quality. So based upon that, do you think that widespread wealth actually results in widespread pursuit of good things or of the
I don't know if everybody heard the question. So if increasing wealth, that's really loud, isn't it? If increasing wealth enables other things in life that are worth, I want to stand up so I can see you, enables other things in life that fill out a life worth living, is it possible that increasing wealth also gives rise to things like literature and music that swamp out the good literature and music? So we get sort of, am I understanding this right? We might get a lot more music and things to read, but a lot of it is terrible. And maybe it swamps out the stuff that we ought to be reading. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah, that's certainly true. So it's a good question. And so one part of the sort of approach I take to political economy that I didn't explicitly mention but may bear on this question is that in my view there is no such thing as a perfect polity. We will never have perfection. So I think human beings are fallen, imperfect creatures. So the most we can hope for is to mitigate the bad things. So the world I work in, or that I believe we work in, is one where and sometimes looking for the least bad alternatives. So what do we get? How does that relate to your particular question? I was a PLS major, and I feel honored and privileged to have had the opportunity to read many of the things that I read in PLS. As far as I know, no member of my family had ever read a lot of the things that I read. So I feel, as I say, privileged and honored to have been part of that community. So what do we get in a society where everybody has access to all sorts of things? And so it's not just that some people are reading the Aeneid and the Iliad. Almost anybody can read it, but they can also read a lot of other stuff. So this is where I think this might actually point to a pretty significant difference between Professor Deneen and me. What I think that means is that it puts responsibility for leading a virtuous life and then judging what a virtuous life is squarely where I think it should be, which is on you and me, not on a set of other institutions. So Professor Deneen is worried about the choices that we might make, and maybe you are too, I don't know, I don't want to put this on you, but I'm worried about the choices, rightly worried, you know, I don't know what you think about Taylor Swift, but maybe Taylor Swift isn't quite like Beethoven. Fair enough. So quite rightly worried about that sort of thing. But where should we place the blame for that? So there are two ways we might approach that. Limit the ability of people to choose Taylor Swift and encourage or nudge them to choose Beethoven, or just hold them responsible for their choices. And I guess this is what I would say. I'm going to try to be deliberately provocative here. Maybe I'll insult you if I can. If it was good enough for God, it's good enough for Professor Deneen. In other words, God decided, could have made human beings, could have created us with the ability to choose only the right, but he didn't. He created us with the ability to choose not just the right, but also the wrong. Why did he do that? Because that's what makes us a moral being. A moral being is an accountable being, one who will be held responsible for his or her choices. So it's not the institutions that should be to blame in that case. I think it's the individual. So that gives us a role, including the Catholic Church a role, to be the models for the sorts of things we believe, the sorts of lives, liberal arts education, family, religion that we think are the ones people ought to pursue, music and literature. That's a role for Notre Dame. But if people choose otherwise, I think we need to give them the responsibility, the liberty to choose, but then just hold them responsible for the choices they make.
Okay, another student question. Yeah, go ahead, Phaedra.
Cronyism.
Was there ever a time in which this idea that free market capitalism existed, absent cronyism?
No.
And if that time hasn't existed, because you mentioned imperialism, that seems like an essential component of Western economic expansion, at least in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And so, has non-cronyism ever existed? And if it hasn't, how do we pursue that? How do we eliminate it?
Is that to me? Or?
Very good. Very good question. The question was, has capitalism ever existed without cronyism? Does capitalism always lead to cronyism and also possibly imperialism?
Good question. Has there ever been a time when there was no human sin? The answer to that is no. So that's why I say living in a world of imperfection, what you have to look at is relatively better or relatively worse. So that long, low red line in that graph, that's all when almost all you had was extraction. The transition comes when some people start arguing that maybe extraction is morally wrong. Maybe the way to deal with people is rather than extracting wealth or other things from them, we should cooperate with them voluntarily. And as that idea begins to spread and take hold and shift to other places, you get more and more prosperity. So is there a world in which there is no cronyism? I don't think so. I don't know what it would be. But are there places that are relatively closer to the sort of theoretical example of what, economically speaking, not morally, economically speaking, a more completely free market economy? Sure. And we can rank countries all the way down from the most free to the least free, and that certainly is the case. Go ahead, you have a follow-up? Yeah.
It seems that democracy is a way of combating political extraction.
It can be, but it's not a panacea. So ancient Athens had a democracy, but it also was based on a slave economy. So just having that, I think really what you have to have, I mean, the ideal is to have a set of things. Certain set of political, economic institutions, certain set of political institutions, and a certain set of moral institutions. Will we ever have that perfectly? I don't know. Have there been places that have more closely approximated it? Absolutely.
My point, what is that if political democracy is the solution to political extraction and power, would an economic democracy or a participatory economic system be a way of solving economic extraction?
Yeah, I don't know.
Let me just
you
so
have to tell
everyone
me an awful lot more about what you have in mind.
the question so just so everyone could hear would be democracy, economic democracy,
like a
rules
whack-a-mole
favoring economic democracy help combat the cronyism that seems to always arise with capitalism?
It might. I mean, I think the answer is that it's hard to come up with a single set of political institutions because if we all agree, or many of us agree, that cronyism is bad, I certainly think that cronyism is bad. Are there places that have quasi-market economies but also have a lot of cronyism? Yeah. Are there some that don't? Yes. How exactly do you get them? I think culture has a big role to play, which I think is an important aspect and maybe a place where we might agree. That we have a big role there's a big role for cultural institutions like the church and other moral exemplars to play. Democracy might help, but it all depends on how you do it. There are plenty of democracies that are quite autocratic, quite tyrannical. So depending on how that's structured, I don't think there's a single set of solutions for that. Yeah.
Good. Can't resist a cowboy hat.
Oh, yes, very nice.
Real loud so we can hear you.
I'm a senior economics major, and putting aside our current system and just thinking on a strictly theoretical level, is there a level of inequality, or do we have a responsibility as a society to guarantee equality of result, or is natural inequality okay given that we provide equality of opportunity? And then secondarily, Professor Deneen, I don't mean to cherry pick, but I think it gets to the crux of your pragmatic argument. You spoke about, the period of the hockey stick, and I think you attributed a large portion of it to extraction of fossil fuels. And I just think, do you think that we could get to a point in a society where we can replace fossil fuels with renewable energy without capitalism?
Can you repeat the second question again? This is very
do you think, just for Professor Deneen, do you think that we could reduce our dependency on fossil fuels without capitalism? Just kind of to get to the crux of your pragmatic argument.
Could we reduce it?
Fuels without capitalism, was that the question? Well, let's start with that one, Patrick.
There are a lot of people in this building who are experts on energy. What I merely pointed out is that what we think of as the hockey stick, I really think about it's and what we call the Industrial Revolution is it's the age of fossil fuels. It corresponds exactly to when we begin to put fossil fuels into basically fueling our economy. So yeah, a lot of ingenuity took place with that. A lot of inventions took place with that. But what allows the increase quite substantially is the increasing production, extraction, and use of fossil fuels. And of course, we're dealing with the consequences of that in the form of climate change. It's a cost, but maybe that's a cost we're just going to have to be willing to pay. But we're also dealing with it seems to me, with how we're going to confront that question. And that is a question it seems that we're going to face. We might be able to prolong our fossil fuel dependency by new forms of extraction, fracking now, new ingenuity, new ways of extracting it, but there's probably not a limitless supply. So maybe it's possible. I can't see into the future. Maybe we'll have ways of nuclear fission, new ways of using and procuring energy. But I will say the following, that based on what we know today about the planet, and then there may be ways we can extract things. We'll become like those creatures in, what's the movie? Independence Day. Right? That's what we're going to become. We're going to just go to other planets and extract from those planets when we run through ours. But if we move the hockey stick forward, we're probably going to need additional planets if we want everyone to come up to that level of consumption that we enjoy. Jared Diamond has suggested we'll need 37 for the entire world to enjoy our level of prosperity. And I don't know if there are 37 worlds we can use to extract, but it's a question mark. So I guess to your question, I'm not an expert in this. I don't know a lot about this, but it seems to me it's a question we should ask. Today we talk a lot about sustainability. How do we sustain what's a finite resource? That's a question.
I'll say one thing about that. This is a very old argument that Professor Deneen is giving us. In fact, that goes back at least, there was a little bit in your response to me, those remarks, where I thought you were giving us a kind of, hey kids, get off of my lawn romanticism about the past. I can't believe these crazy kids no longer, they're all on digital media or something, and who knows what the future's going to be instead of working at Caterpillar their entire lives or something. And then you sort of moved away from that. But now I think you're returning to this. You remember Thomas Malthus at the beginning of the turn of the 19th century? He said, holy cow, these curves are going to cross. Right now, we barely have enough food to support the people who live on the earth. And those curves increase at different rates. So the increasing food supply goes at what he called a arithmetic rate. So that's linear. whereas the population increases at what he called the geometric rate, which is exponential. He said those curves are going to cross, and when those curves cross, and that's going to come soon, my friends, so begin to repent, it's going to be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. Now, that was in the beginning of the 19th century. Well, it didn't happen during his lifetime, or during the 19th century, or during the 20th century, yet every decade or so throughout that entire period, we get the same argument. We're going to need 37 more planets. I don't know what the limit is. So when you ask what's the limit of the amount of production that we can get out of the resources we have, I have no idea, because I don't know what the limits of human ingenuity is. But I take it a little bit like, I think it's analogous to saying something like, what are the limits of human knowledge? You know, human beings are finite creatures. Rationality is limited. Pretty soon we're going to run out of ability to know stuff. Well, maybe, but you know, we're pretty good at figuring out things to get around that, like Google. Now, I wouldn't have been able to predict Google 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and neither would you, or neither would Malthus or Adam Smith or Aristotle. But human beings are pretty inventive creatures. Now, does that mean we're going to solve every single problem? No. But does that mean we might be able to come up with things in the future that we can't now imagine that might improve our lives in the future? Yeah, I think that's a pretty good bet.
I want to rephrase the question about inequality. Either of you in favor of universal basic income?
Oh my goodness, really? That's where you want to end?
Patrick?
Again, it's not my area of any real relevant knowledge. The fact that
The universal basic income, which young
Do you
people
not
seem
want
to
to talk
love.
about that one? Or do you? Go
well,
ahead.
I guess I would just say the following: that it seems to me that universal basic income is increasingly promoted, oddly enough, by market fundamentalists. I think in the anticipation that we will increasingly not need a human workforce. So it's an anticipation of essentially having a workless population without work. And it just seems to me that at a certain level, if you want to talk about fallenness, one of the conditions of the Garden of Eden is that we should earn our bread by the sweat of our brow. So it seems to me that condition is contrary to what the...
to having no work to do?
Having no work. And it's simply a matter, I think
Yeah,
that
no, I
there's
agree
a
with
certain dignity that's achieved in and through one's work, a
agree.
certain sense of accomplishment and the sense that you've done something of worth in the world. So I'm deeply suspicious of these proposals.
Okay, let's get one more question in.
I was going to say something.
Okay, go ahead, Christian.
I'm Christian, political science major, and Tocqueville fellow, Professor Munoz. Professor Otteson mentioned basic references to nudges.
Oh, yeah. Did you catch my allusion? I guess you must have. Yeah.
And I'm curious, you seem to suggest that they were at odds with the principles of capitalism. For the most part, at least, and I think we'd all agree with that, at least in terms of the example you use, nudging away from Taylor Swift towards Beethoven or something like that. But my question is about, more non-controversial concepts of social welfare. For instance, using warning labels on cigarette packages to nudge away from smoking cigarettes, or rearranging, our choice architecture, rearranging fruit in front of Twinkies so that school children can choose fruit over Twinkies. Are these, examples of nudges, violations of freedom inherent in capitalism, or where do you draw the line?
It's a good question. So did everybody hear the question?
Questions about Cass Sunstein's idea of nudges. Cass Sunstein, who's going to be here in a few weeks, about nudging people. Is it legitimate for government to nudge people towards better choices, fruit instead of Twinkies, warning labels on cigarettes, so everyone can become obese, things like that?
Cass Sunstein was a co-author with Richard Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize largely for exactly this work. So are there cases in which human beings, we're learning now that human beings make not just mistakes in reasoning, but maybe systematic mistakes. So structuring the choices that appear to them without forcing them to make one choice or another might enable them to make choices that even they themselves might afterwards or after the fact might say that that's a better choice than what I would have made without the nudge. So your question is that a good thing? Or no, I guess your question is not just is it a good thing, but is it inconsistent with capitalist principles? I suppose it would be with the market fundamentalists that Professor Deneen keeps talking about. I don't think that's me. But I'll tell you what my view about that, since you asked me, I suppose you want to know what my view about that is. I think nudging is part of what it means to be a human being. What I mean by that is we are, in some respect, judging creatures, not nudging, judging creatures. We begin judging one another when we wake up, and we judge each other all day long, and we don't stop until we go to sleep at night. Some of those judgments, so we judge everybody on what they think and say and how they dress and how they look and what they read and drink and eat and listen to. Some of those judgments we make of others ought to be communicated to them. And when we communicate our judgments to them, not all of them, but when we communicate our judgments, positive and negative, those are effectively nudges. So one aspect of human happiness is loving and familial and friendly associations with other people. I don't think for the most part people can be happy in isolation. We are social creatures. In order for us to have communities in which we actually do engage with one another on loving or family or friendly relationships, we have to have a certain system. I would call it, system's too formal of a word, but a certain texture of moral and other kinds of sensibilities. Nudging one another is exactly the creation of this kind of community. So if you think that people are making choices, or you might be able to get them to make better choices, by all means. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The only potential worry about that, I suppose maybe this is what you're asking about related to economics, is, well, should decisions about that be made by third parties in Washington, D.C.? So my view, which is not probably the market fundamentalist view that Professor Deneen was talking about, is that I'm a kind of federalist. The farther away from you somebody is, the less they know about you, and so the less likely they're making decisions about you are likely to be good ones for you. So the default should be, let you make your own decisions. Let your family and friends help nudge you, the ones who know you best. But the further away somebody is, the less they can possibly know about your situation, so the less they could possibly know about what's actually a good choice for you. Until by the time we get all the way to Washington, D.C., or to the European Union, they know effectively nothing about you. So if you're going to ask them to make decisions about how to structure choices for you, you're going to get bad things happening. On the other hand, if your family and friends do it, and if you undertake the personal responsibility to help your family and friends, people you care about and love, and also know something about, to make good choices, I think that's exactly what you should do as a moral and virtuous person.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. A model exchange.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick.